Okay, quick recap of last week in chapter 1. There is this family. Elimelech is the husband, Naomi is the wife. It turns out that they live in a town called Bethlehem, and they live in a really uncertain time. In fact, they live in a difficult time where there's this large famine that comes in Bethlehem. And as we continue to look at the details of the story, it turns out that Elimelech, the husband, kind of loses faith, gives up on God. Naomi, the wife, continues to hold on to faith, continues to believe, but they get desperate. At some point or another, they decide they have to sell the family land. And so for some chunk of money, they sold their family land, which means that they let go of their inheritance. And they had money to live off of, to buy food, to maybe put a roof over their head, but slowly but surely, all their means just dwindled away, and they found themselves left with nothing. In desperation, they make really what would be kind of the last choice decision to go away to the country of their historic enemies. The Moabites were the historic enemies of God's people Israel, and although things are bad there in Bethlehem, they think, well, we're just going to go there, and there's a phrase in chapter 1, for a while. I mean, they just see it as being very, very momentarily. It's just for now. We're just going to go there, and they hope to eke out an existence and hopefully return quickly. That short period of time they were hoping for really elongates. They're there for some 10 years. In the meantime, they had a couple of kids, Mahlon and Chilion. As they get there, the father, Elimelech, faces more and more tough times. Eventually, he dies. Tragedy strikes, and they're left alone. Mahlon and Chilion, they get married to Moabite women, which means that they hadn't really grown up in the faith. They marry outside of the faith. And then finally, the two of them, as they're trying to eke out a living, die. And Naomi, tragedy, double tragedy, triple tragedy, is left just with her daughters-in-law. They really struggle. They have a hard time. Finally, Naomi hears that the famine is over. She prepares to return. She really has no hope in life left. I mean, she's older now. She sees as though she's saddling down her daughters-in-law, so she says to both of them, listen, I'm going to leave. You stay. At least you can have a good life here. You can remarry. You can, enjoy the things of life. I have no hope. I'm bitter. She says, I blame God for it, and I'm going to go back. You guys stay. Orpah, she does, I guess, what we call the reasonable thing. She says, okay, I love you. Goodbye, and she leaves. Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, in this moment that I think is just a moment of crisis. On the one hand, she can turn away from her mother-in-law. She can enjoy a good life. She can have the finer things of life. She can have a better of life. But two things. One, she has now taken on the faith of her mother-in-law. She knows if she stays, likely her faith is going to fade, and so she doesn't want to do that. And second, she knows that if she walks away from her mother-in-law will walk away alone, almost certainly to death. And it's clear that Ruth loves Naomi, and so won't let that happen. And although, if she goes with Naomi back to Israel, she'll have a terrible life, and she knows it. Single woman, one of the enemies of God's people, probably to be abused, mistreated in every imaginable way. She knows she can maybe go and keep this woman alive. In that sense, she sees that she's really going to be a suffering servant. And in this moment of crisis where she can choose the better life or the worse life, a life where she might have things, comfortable, or a life where, frankly, she's going to throw her life away, but she can keep this woman alive. She chooses to go and suffer and serve Naomi. And anyway, that's chapter 1. We're going to pick it up in chapter 2. In that sense, Ruth really becomes a redeemer or a savior of Naomi in this book. There's another redeemer in this book, a man named Boaz. He plays a very prominent role, and we're going to pick up in verse 1 of chapter 2. It says, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. She went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived in Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So Boaz shows Ruth this incredible kindness. He's willing to protect her. It's obvious she's in a lot of danger, and he sees that. He's willing to protect her. He shows her a ton of kindness. He lets her not only just glean on the edges, but actually come to the center, and tells his men, hey, even, don't pull them all the way out, but leave extra for her. She comes home at night. Naomi is just over, where did you go? How did you get this much grain? She can't hardly believe it. And we'll pick up in verse 19. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed is the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." And she added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Now, when she says that, he is one of our guardian redeemers, she brings up something that was part of this culture and something that's part of the Old Testament that we frankly aren't that familiar with. And so there's a whole grid of thoughts that need to run through our mind, which may not be there yet. So what I've done is I have created some drawings to kind of help out. Some of you know that I tend to do this to kind of try to make things simpler than they might otherwise be. And what I'd like to do is talk about what in the world is a guardian redeemer. And so, here's a family of four. And let me tell you about this family of four. This is a standard Israelite family. When God brought them up out of Egypt, they were slaves there, and he brought them with Joshua into the land, and he gave them that land. To every single family, they all got their own plot of land. So every family, here's my land, here's their land. And when you're standing in your land, I mean, wow, God gave this to me. And there are boundary stones, so on this side and in front and behind and over here, there are boundary stones. Beyond the boundary stone, that's not yours, but this place, this is the grace that God has given me. Now, when you would stand in your land and say, "This is my land," you don't mean like ultimately mine. Every Israelite knew it ultimately all belonged to God. I'm a tenant here. I'm a steward of the resources God has given, but he's given me this grace that I could have this land, that I could plant crops, that I could, harvest my crops, that I can exist here. There's something to sustain me, and every single family had that blessing. Now, God, I guess what I can say about him, he's really practical. And he knew some things about human beings that probably all of us know as well. For instance, he knows that, I guess there's no other way to put this, there's some people who are more talented and some who are less talented. Some who are better farmers, they get a better yield from their crop. There's some who are better business people. They'd sell their grain for more. Then there are other people who are not so talented. They're not green thumbs. They can't farm very well. When it comes to business, they just stink at it. And so that's how it is. And it's not just about talent. You know how it is in life. There's also just a whole set of life circumstances. So there's some of us, we're just born into the right conditions, right? You know the old phrase, some people were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. I mean, they just had it from the moment they were born. It was just all there. And there's other of us who were born into tough circumstances, and we just struggled as a result of, the hand that we got dealt, so to speak. And God knew that there would just be these variations in life by our talents, by our abilities, by our life circumstances. And so it would tend to be that some people would get richer and some people would get poorer. And that's just kind of the way it is. One of the things that could happen, of course, to a family that got poorer, what they had is they had the land, And of course it was possible, and you could do this. You owned that land. You could at some point, if you're running on empty, you could decide, I'm going to sell this land to someone. And so someone who's done better in life, who maybe through talent or life circumstance or whatever, they just have a pile of money, they could take from that pile of money and they say, listen, there's a great business opportunity for me to get your land, and I don't know what land goes for today. Maybe you think about a plot of land, a few $100,000, maybe $500,000. Here you go. I'm going to take from all my money a portion, and I'm going to give it to you, and then, of course, I get that land. I get to farm it. I get to, take care of it. It becomes, for now, my land. And of course, this is the story of Elimelech and Ruth and their sons. At some point, because life circumstances were so hard, a famine occurred. They got so desperate, they finally decided this was the last option. We're going to sell the land. And so they got some pile of money, and they started to live off that. And we now know the story that times were so tough that eventually they ran out of money. And they eventually, like I said, they went off to Moab to try and eke out a living because the money was gone. And then, you know the rest of the story, tragedy strikes. So Elimelech dies, the two sons die, and Naomi is left totally alone with just her two daughters-in-law. And she really is in a desperate situation. Now, guardian redeemer. Let's set aside the details of this story for a minute and just ask this question. If, let's say you're a family of four that sold off your land and you've lost all your money, what are your options? What are your choices? And actually, everything I'm about to say is found in Leviticus chapter 25. So you want extra credit today? Yeah, extra credit, right? You want extra credit? You can go home today. You can read Leviticus chapter 25. And catch the details of it. I'm just going to simply tell you that there were two different ways that you could kind of recoup if you wound up in this situation. You sold off the land and you'd now become dirt poor. There are two ways. One of the ways in Leviticus chapter 25, every 50 years, God saw this ahead of time. He didn't want a situation where people got richer and richer and richer and richer, and other people got poorer and poorer and poorer, and there was finally only a handful of people who owned everything, and everyone else had nothing. So he decided ahead of time, every 50 years, there'd be a reset. Every 50 years, there was a year called the Year of Jubilee, and the idea was this, that no matter what had happened in those prior 50 years, everyone went back to their family's plot of land. And so, even if everything else went bad, when that 50 years came, bam, I'm back. And I've received this grace anew. And wow, God, you've given me this land, and I got a fresh start. And so every 50 years, that was the case. There was a year of Jubilee, and everyone was able to return to their own family's property. God didn't want a situation where there's just a handful of people who have everything, and just everyone has nothing. And so every 15 years, reset, it all evens back out again. And this was, by the way, just meant to be the time of greatest celebration in Israel. Of course, that would benefit mostly the children. I mean, 15 years is a long time, right? So imagine you're 10 years old when your parents run into hard times and they sell that land. I mean, most of your adult life, how long is 50 years? You're going to be like 60 years old. But your parents, they'll be long gone by the time you come. So it could be a very long time. It's not going to benefit the parents. It's going to benefit the children. But God doesn't want a situation where people are just totally disadvantaged, and so he provided for that. There's a second way that, let's say you're a family of four, and you sold off the land, and you have no money left. There's a second way that God provided, and it's this. You can read about it also in Leviticus chapter 25. A close family member, a relative, could be what was called a guardian redeemer, or some Bibles, the translations say kinsman redeemer. And the idea is that, okay, one of your relatives who also has done very, very well could come and pay your debts. So what do you owe? Like $400,000 or $500,000? Okay, they could take from what they had been given by God. They could take a portion of that, and they could pay off the person who bought that land. And by the way, this is the way contracts were written. If you purchased that land, you only had it for 50 years, and there was always a clause. At any time, a close relative can show up, and at any time, they reserve the right to buy that back. So what would happen is they'd take from a portion of their money, they'd give it to the person that they owed the debt to. That person would then go away. Then the guardian redeemer would go away. He wasn't buying that land back for himself. He was doing it because it's my family member and I love them and I want to restore them to life. And you'd have your land back. Now, there's one more wrinkle because we'll get back to the story of Ruth. Her situation looked like this. Year of Jubilee comes. Is that any help to her? It's not, right? Why? She has no family. Who's the land going to come back to? There's an additional wrinkle. How about this guardian redeemer? This guardian redeemer could come. There's an additional wrinkle here. Okay, extra credit. So extra credit was Leviticus 25. Extra credit, Deuteronomy 25. If you read that, here's what you'll find. If a person comes and wants to be the guardian redeemer, not only does he have to take from a portion of his wealth and pay off the person to whom the debt is owed, and that person then would go away so that the field would belong back to, in this case, Naomi. But in addition, because Naomi doesn't have any children, it was required that that relative then marry Naomi and have children. Now, the children would not be considered your children. They would be considered the children of your dead relative. And those children then it's their land. But then on top of that, you know what happens in marriage, right? You know, like my money becomes our money. And I raise all this because I want you to see when Boaz, as the guardian redeemer, went through this entire procedure, I want you to see how costly it was for him. And so let's pick this up. We're going to pick it up in chapter 3. Chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, says this. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight, he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there unless he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovering his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." Now, there's some cultural things going on here, too, that probably are going to get lost on all of us. So here's the idea. When you asked someone to spread the corners of their garments over you, what you are really saying is something like this: "Marry me." So that night, when she got there and he was lying down sleeping and she uncovered the feet so his feet would get cold, he woke up, he startled, he's like, "Who are you?" And I'm Ruth. And it was like she was, down on one knee saying, "Will you marry me? You have to know that." And verse 10, he responds, he says, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you're a woman of noble character." Then he says this: "Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I." Here's what he's saying. He's saying, okay, I'd love to marry you, but another wrinkle in the story, I'm your relative, true, and I'm capable of doing this, yes, but there's someone who's more closely related, which means their first place in line. He basically says, listen, don't worry about a thing. I'm going to take care of it. Just wait. And he kind of hatches this plan. We're going to pick it up in chapter 4. It says, meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. So here's this closer relative who's first in line. The guy's coming along, and Boaz called out. He said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. It says, Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except for you. And then he said, and I am next in line. And the person, by the way, he's never named, who's a more close relative, he says almost right away, yes, I'll do it. I'll redeem it. And, okay, let's go back to our drawings here. Let's see. Where am I? Here we go. This is what he has in mind. He has in mind, okay, this is the situation. I can just take some of my money and, where are we here? Here we are. No, we're at the end. Come back. Okay, here's the situation. He says, look, I can take some of my money and I can give it to him and he will go away. Of course, now this is where it gets more costly. Boaz says, hold on. It's not just a great business opportunity. It's not just a moment for you to purchase a piece of land. And he says, listen, verse 5, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it for yourself. I cannot do it. His first thought is, okay, I'll do it. I want that land. That's a good piece of land. I can really farm that land. I can make a lot of money. But then Boaz says, no, you've got to understand, it's this. You've got to also marry Ruth. And this, you've got to have children with her. Those children won't be your own. And this. All your stuff will become, when you marry someone, you don't only have like a deep, loving relationship, but you also enter into a legal contract. It's legally binding, where all your stuff becomes also her stuff. I mean, this is costly. Not only does he have to pay the debt to buy the land, but then he also has to marry her. And then on top of that, he has to have children with her, and she gets it all. She gets everything. And when whoa, I'm out. That's basically what he says. And I want you to see how costly it is. In fact, I'm just going to put here on the screen these 3 thoughts about a guardian redeemer. First, in order to be the guardian redeemer, you have to be a close relative. I mean, not just anyone can come and pay the debt and get the land. That's not how the contract reads. It has to be someone who is your relative that comes. And so the person, in order to be a guardian redeemer, has to be a close relative. Second, that person has to pay all the debts. Whatever debts are owed, they have to take from their wealth, and they have to give that away. Now, in Ruth's case, not only did you have to pay all the debts, but then you also have to become a husband. And when you become a husband, of course, that's a legal binding contract. All his stuff becomes her stuff. She has a total claim on everything he owns. And when he hears all that, whoa, I can't do it. And by the way, I think actually in this book, Boaz, this is his plan. I mean, he knows how costly it is, and I think he's delighted. He's delighted to take on this obligation and this responsibility. Now, let's just push the story forward. Chapter 4, verse 13. So it says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." It says in verse 16, Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. What an awesome ending to this story. So, if you were here last week, we talked all the way through to this. I mean, just a story of hopelessness, desperation, dark times. A woman who at one point was full of faith became hopeless and bitter and even blaming God. Her life is over. And at the end of the story, there is this grandmother full of joy as she holds a baby in her arms. And I just see her smiling down at this child, realizing, like, I've gotten it all back. Like in a twist and turn, I could have never, like everything that I lost, God's given me back and more. And this child, of course, becomes the grandfather of the great King David. And I want you to see something. This is by way of summary, so to speak. I want you to see something. There are two, when it comes to Naomi's life, the redemption of her life, the salvation that she experiences, there are 2 people who play a key role. The first is Ruth. And I just have this title here, Suffering Servant. She set aside the comfortable life she could have had. She set aside any opportunity for riches and for really just comfort in life. And probably the best way to put it, she threw her life away so that Naomi could live. I mean, what a love that she had, that she would go to suffer to keep this person alive. That's Ruth. There's another redeemer who plays a big role, and that person is Boaz. We just have the title there, Guardian Redeemer. And we've already said what it takes to be a guardian redeemer. You have to be a close relative. You have to be willing to pay all the debts of that person. And then, in her case, you have to be willing to marry her. And it becomes legally binding that all your stuff becomes her stuff. Here's what I want you to see. Not only did these 2 people come together to become the grandfather and grandmother of David, but I'm sure you know this, Jesus is a descendant of David, and so these 2 characters, Ruth and Boaz, are like the grandfather and grandmother of Jesus. And I've told you this before, all the Old Testament anticipates and looks forward to the coming of Jesus. And I'd like you to think about who Jesus is and what he's done under these same 2 headings. First, whatever we would say about Ruth being a suffering servant, an immigrant who left the comfortable to go and suffer, Jesus was the ultimate suffering servant. Not only does the Bible call him that, a suffering servant, but he left the glories of heaven to be born in a manger. He eschewed the comforts of life. He came to live knowing that he'd be persecuted and tortured and suffer, and he ultimately threw his life away to keep us alive. Jesus, also the guardian redeemer. And I'd like to talk through this. So when I talk about the gospel, I always do so under 3 words: sin, salvation, service. If you come here for any period of time, you'll hear that again and again and again. Sin, salvation, service. And when we talk about sin, we talk about how sin has brought on a total misery in our life, a hopelessness, a darkness, because there's nothing we can do. We've become penniless. I mean, just debtors who can't make our own way. And this is what God did. He sent someone to be a substitute. And when we talk about Jesus, there's 2 things I always note why he's the perfect substitute. He's fully human and fully God. And if you know the story of Ruth, then you'll know why he has to be fully human. He couldn't have sent an angel, he couldn't have sent an elephant to be the substitute, because a guardian redeemer must be related to us. He must be our kinsman. He must be our relative. Anyway, what else did Jesus do? He paid our debts. You know what I always say? God took all our sin, all its consequences. He took it off our shoulders, and he put it on Jesus and punished him in our place. All the debt that we owe, he paid. But now, and I think this is so important as we talk about the book of Ruth, the third thing. You know, of course, that the church is called what? The bride of Christ. What does that mean? You understand that it means that Jesus considers himself our husband. So when we say that Jesus loves us, it's only part of the story. You know what a marriage is? It's an intensely intimate and loving relationship, but you know it's more than that. Because when you enter into a marriage, it's a legally binding contract. And do you know what it means? It means all that belongs to Jesus belongs to who? Like his glory is ours. His name, his fortune, what he'll inherit. You know, what will Jesus inherit? I mean, this entire universe is his. Whose else is it? I mean, if we are the bride of Christ, what does that mean? And I just think, boy, that's phenomenal. Everything that belongs to Jesus, spiritually, physically, now as Christians belongs to us. And once you see that this is what Jesus has done through his death and resurrection, this is what his life is all about, that not only would he come to be a suffering servant, but to be our guardian redeemer, to as our relative, pay our debts and take us to himself. You have to understand he'll never leave us, he'll never forsake us. And no matter what your story is, what you're going through, what the darkness is, what the lack of hope is, what the bitterness is, you have to understand this is the conclusion, this is the end when as the church, those who in faith surrender themselves to Jesus Christ. You know, at the very end, there's going to be this wedding celebration where we are brought into the presence of Christ, where it becomes plain that he's our husband and we are his bride. And I just want to urge you, if you've walked in these doors today and you haven't given your life to Jesus, if you've felt the effects of life, the misery of life, and you don't know where there's hope here, and I just urge you to turn and give your life to Jesus in the biggest way.